The night attack at Targoviste was a battle fought between forces of Vlad Tepes, Prince of Wallachia, and Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire on Thursday, June 17, 1462. The conflict initially started with Vlad's refusal to pay a tax on non-Muslim subjects to the Sultan of Turkey, and this intensified when Vlad invaded Bulgaria. In response, Mehmed raised a great army with the objective to conquer Wallachia and annex it to his empire. The two leaders fought a series of skirmishes, the most notable one being the night attack, where Vlad attacked the Turkish camp in the night in an attempt to kill Mehmed. After the assassination attempt had failed, Mehmed marched to the Wallachian capital of Targoviste, where he found a few men with cannons. After leaving the capital, Mehmed discovered 23,844 impaled Turks whom Vlad had killed during his invasion of Bulgaria. The number is mentioned by Vlad himself in a letter to Matthias Corvinus. The Sultan and his troops then sailed to Braulia and burned it to the ground before retreating to Adrianople. Both sides claimed victory in the campaign, and Mehmed's forces returned home with many captured slaves, horses, and cattle. Just to give you a bit of backstory, on September 26, 1459, Pope Pius II called for a new crusade against the Ottomans, and on January 14, 1460, at the Congress of Mantua, the Pope proclaimed the official crusade that was to last for 3 years. His plan, however, failed, and the only European leader that showed any form of enthusiasm for the crusade was Vlad Tepes. Because of the lack of enthusiasm shown by the other European leaders, Mehmed took the opportunity to take an offensive stand. Later that year, he captured the last independent Serbian city, and in 1461 he convinced the Greek despot of Morea to give up his stronghold. Soon after, its capital Mistra and Corinth followed suit and surrendered themselves without any struggle. Vlad Tepes' only remaining ally was a man named Mihaly. Mihaly was captured in 1460 by the Turks while he was traveling in Bulgaria. Mihaly's men were tortured to death, while Mihaly himself was killed by being sawn in half. Later that year, Mehmed sent envoys to Vlad to urge him to pay the tax that is imposed on non-Muslim occupants. Vlad Tepes provoked Mehmed by having the envoys that Mehmed sent killed. In a letter dated September 10, 1460, he addressed the Transylvanian Saxons of Kronstadt, which is today Brasov. He warned them of Mehmed's invasion plan and asked for their support. Now, keep in mind he was at war with these people at the time. Vlad Tepes had not paid the annual jizya, which is the tax, of 10,000 ducats since 1459. In addition to this, Mehmed asked him for 1,000 boys that were used to be trained as janissaries. Vlad Tepes refused the demand, and the Turks crossed the Danube and started to do their own recruiting, to which Vlad reacted by capturing the Turks and impaling them wherever he found them. The conflict continued until 1461, when Mehmed asked the prince to come to Constantinople and negotiate with him. In late November of 1461, Vlad was engaging in a bit of subterfuge. He had wrote to Mehmed that he could not afford to pay the tribute, as his war against the Hungarian Saxons in Transylvania had emptied all of his resources, and that he could not leave Wallachia and risk having the Hungarian king take over his domains. He further promised to pay the Sultan plenty of gold when he could afford to, and that he would go to Constantinople if the Sultan would send him a pasha to rule over Wallachia in his absence. Meanwhile, the Sultan received intelligence reports that revealed Vlad actually had an alliance with the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus. The Turkish Sultan was very suspicious based on the intelligence reports that he had, so he tried to double-cross Vlad by agreeing to his proposition of sending a pasha over. So the Sultan sent over a pasha to stage a diplomatic meeting with Vlad, but with the orders to ambush Vlad at the diplomatic meeting and thereafter take him to Constantinople. Vlad, on the other hand, had also received intelligence about this ambush, so Vlad set an ambush of his own, sort of ambushing the ambushers. Hamza brought with him 1,000 cavalry, and when passing through the narrow pass north of Giurgiu, Vlad launched a surprise attack. The Wallachians had the Turks surrounded, and fired with their crude cannons until the entire expedition force was killed. Historians credit Vlad Tepes as one of the first European crusaders to use gunpowder in a deadly and artistic way. In a letter to Corvinus, dated February 11, 1462, he wrote that Hamza Pasha was captured close to the former Wallachian fortress in Giurgiu, and then disguised himself as a Turk and advanced with his cavalry towards the fortress, where he ordered the guards, in Turkish, to open the gates. They did open the gates, and Vlad attacked and destroyed the fortress. In his next move, he went on a campaign and slaughtered enemy soldiers and population that might have sympathized with the Turks, first in southern Wallachia, then in Bulgaria, by crossing the frozen Danube River. While in Bulgaria, he divided his army into several smaller groups and covered around 800 kilometers in 2 weeks, as they killed over 23,000 Turks. The sheer brutality of this campaign that Vlad Tepes was waging is made clear in a letter that he wrote to Matthias Corvinus in February 11th, 1462. Vlad said, quote, "I have killed peasants, men, and women, old and young, who lived at Oblijica and Novoselo, where the Danube flows into the sea, up to Rahova, which is located near Chilia, from the lower Danube up to such places as Samovit and Gihigen," probably pronounced that wrong. "We killed 23,884 Turks, without counting those whom we burned in their homes, or the Turks whose heads were cut off by our soldiers. Thus, your highness, you must know that I have broken the peace with Sultan Mehmed." While Vlad was waging his total war campaign, the Christians in Bulgaria and the other lands that his armies were traversing through were spared, and a lot of them decided to relocate to Wallachia. After hearing about the devastation, Mehmed, who was in the process of sieging a fortress in Corinth, sent his Grand Vizier, Muhammad, with an army of 18,000 men to destroy the Wallachian port of Braiva. Vlad Tepes turned back and defeated the army. In this battle, Vlad's men managed to kill 10,000 Turkish soldiers. Vlad's victories in these battles were celebrated throughout the Christian parts of Europe. Even some of the people that Vlad had been warring with were just celebrating his victory, and cities were having huge celebrations and thanking God for the victory that he granted his fellow Christian soldiers. Needless to say, Mehmed was pissed, absolutely pissed. The fact that his jihad, I guess for lack of better words, was being stifled, and that a Christian equivalent, the crusade, was really ramping up, and this Wallachian prince was just causing him so much havoc. Mehmed decided to abandon the current siege he was engaging in Corinth and Greece, and he decided to just take on Vlad head to head. He wanted Vlad dead, and I'm sure Vlad wanted Mehmed impaled higher and higher on that stake. Something bad was about to go down. In mid-April to early May of 1462, the Sultan had decided that he was just going to get this Vlad guy. He was really going to just nip this in the bud and annex Wallachia. He assembled a massive regiment of men. Some estimates range from 150,000 men to 400,000 men. Either way, this was huge. A Greek historian described this whole regiment that he was building up as huge, second in size only to the one the Sultan had led against Constantinople when he conquered that ancient, powerful city. Mehmed's forces were highly organized, and this was in great contrast to Vlad's forces. Mehmed's forces consisted of janissaries, which are elite slave troops, regular infantry soldiers, sacrificial units composed of slaves who would win their freedom if they survived, and they probably wouldn't, archers, the custodians of the Sultan's weapons who also protected the flanks of the battlefields, the pikemen, men who handled the firearms, and the Praetorian Guard, which served as the Sultan's personal bodyguard. Even Vlad's half-brother, Radu the Handsome, was in this force to march against his own half-brother Vlad Tepes. Vlad's forces, on the other hand, was just anybody he could muster up. He called for a mobilization that included not only men of military age, but also of women and of children from the age 12 and up. He also included many gypsy slaves. Various sources mention the strength of his army between 22,000 and 31,000, with the most popular accepted number set at 30,000. The majority of Vlad's army consisted of peasants and shepherds, while the boyars, which were essentially the noblemen of Wallachia, rode on horseback, but they were very few in number. They were armed with lances, swords, daggers, and wore chainmail armor. Vlad's personal guard consisted of mercenaries from many countries, and even some gypsy slaves that just excelled at combat. Vlad's forces and the Turkish forces met at Turnu Severin at night, where they engaged in a skirmish, and the Turkish forces were actually able to push Vlad back a little bit. Upon his retreat, Vlad decided to institute a complete scorched earth policy. He poisoned the waters, he created marshes and fields where he diverted small rivers to slow the advance of the enemy troops. Traps were created, the punji pits, that kind of thing. All the animals were either killed or evacuated to the mountains. And as Mehmed's army advanced over the course of about a week, they suffered from fatigue. There was nothing for them to eat, nothing for them to drink, and there was a lot of small guerrilla attacks on the Turkish forces, and this really put a damper on the morale. Vlad even engaged in biowarfare, in a sense, where he would take people that were infected with leprosy, tuberculosis, black plague, and he would send those people to intermingle with the Turkish people, and it caused a lot of havoc. He spread disease throughout the Ottoman army, and that really put a damper on them. The Turks had continued their advance toward Targoviste, and on June 17th, the Turks had camped south of the capital, and that's when Vlad launched his night attack with 24,000 men. Vlad was able to freely walk about the Turkish camp disguised as a Turk, and he was doing this more to scout. He was really looking for the Sultan's tent and to learn about the organization. Vlad had learned through his trip through the camp that the soldiers were not allowed to leave their tents at night, so to not cause undue confusion in the case of there being an attack on the camp. 3 hours after the sun had set that night is when Vlad sprung his attack. They fought almost until dawn, but it wasn't continuous fighting. It was more of several smaller attacks. Vlad tried really hard to find the Sultan's tent so he could go in and gut the Sultan himself. Sadly, he picked the wrong tent, and he went to the tent of two Grand Viziers, Ishak Pasha and Muhammad Pasha, which was still a pretty good haul, but he was determined to get the Sultan, and sadly, he was unable to. I can't imagine how much that would have changed the entire course of European history had Vlad actually been successful in killing the Sultan that night. A Wallachian soldier that engaged in the night attack described it like this: "The Sultan besieged him and discovered him in a certain mountain where the Wallachian was supported by the natural strength of the place. There, Vlad had hidden himself along with his 24,000 of his men who had willingly followed him. When Vlad realized he would either perish from hunger or fall into the hands of a very cruel enemy, and considering both eventualities unworthy of brave men, he dared commit an act worthy of being remembered. Calling his men together and explaining the situation to them, he easily persuaded them to enter the enemy camp. He divided the men so that either they should die bravely in battle with glory and honor, or else, should destiny prove favorable to them, they should avenge themselves against the enemy in an exceptional manner. So making use of some Turkish prisoners who had been caught at twilight when they were wandering about imprudently at nightfall, Vlad penetrated into the Turkish camp with part of his troops, all the way up to the fortifications, and during the entire night, he sped like lightning in every direction and caused great slaughter. So much so that had the other commander, whom he had entrusted his remaining forces had been equally brave, or had the Turks not fully obeyed the repeated orders from the Sultan to not abandon their garrisons, the Wallachian undoubtedly would have gained the greatest and most brilliant victory. But the other commander, a boyar named Galesh, did not dare attack the camp from the other side as had been agreed upon. Vlad carried out an incredible massacre without losing many men in such a major encounter. Though many were wounded, he abandoned the enemy camp before daybreak and returned to the same mountain from which he had come. No one dared pursue him, since he had caused such terror and turmoil. I learned by questioning those who had participated in the battle that the Sultan lost all confidence in the situation. During the night, the Sultan abandoned the camp and fled in a shameful manner, and he would have continued to this way, had he not been reprimanded by his friends and brought back almost against his will. While this was a major victory for Vlad, what happened next is one of Vlad's most notorious acts, the Forest of the Dead. Janissaries, under the command of the Turks, pursued the Wallachians and killed 1,000 to 2,000 of them. Total casualties for the conflict are numbered as 5,000 for the Wallachian side, 15,000 for the Ottomans. Even though the morale of the Sultan and his army was low, Mehmed decided to besiege the capital of Targoviste. Instead, he found it deserted with the gates wide open, which is really strange. The Turkish army entered the capital, and for half an hour, the army marched on a road that was bordered by some 20,000 impaled Turks. They found the rotten corpse of Hamza Pasha impaled on the highest stake to symbolize his high ranking. The Sultan was seized with amazement and said that it was not possible to deprive his country of a man who had done such great deeds, who had such a diabolical understanding of how to govern his realm and its people, and he said that a man who had done such things was worth much. Vlad had survived all the absolute insanity in this period, and he claimed victory for himself and for Wallachia. Subsequently, the Sultan of Turkey also claimed victory, even though he retreated. But upon his retreat, he did burn down some ports and took a lot of slaves and stole a lot of animals. So both sides claimed victory, but I would almost call it a tie. Either way, it was absolutely insane. But yeah, it still trips me out. I can't help but think about what would have happened had Vlad been successful and killed the Sultan during the night attack. I can't imagine how much different the entire world now would be if that one act had succeeded. But either way, that's the night attack at Targoviste. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.